I'm going to start as Rick asked us to do it because we've got a lot to cover. Rick beat me to the punch, but I too was at this conference that Rick had hosted, and it really does seem like a bookend. In fact, I was on a panel with Neal, just coming out here from DC where maybe there was something going on that was a little worrisome. And over the 3 days that we were here, when we took our plane back, it really seemed like the beginning of our COVID issue continued and got a lot worse. But here we are, following this, where things are better on that front, but we've had an election in the meantime, or several elections, but especially one that really does raise these questions of election threats. I'm not going to do long introductions. The very shortest, just to give you a sense of who people are. Jocelyn Benson is the Secretary of State of Michigan, elected in 2018 and again in 2022. And then we have 2 election officials from some of our largest jurisdictions, local jurisdictions in America. Neal Kelley, who is just retired from 17 years of service in Orange County, here a county with almost 2 million registered voters, and Stephen Risher, who was elected in 2020 and actually came into office in the aftermath of the 2020 election, and from Maricopa County, which, depending on how you count, might be the second largest election jurisdiction. I know there's some disputes if anybody from Harris County can kind of let him have the title. That's good. But we have a wide range of state and local experience. We're going to hear from them all. Some things we're going to hear are not pleasant. I think we're literally going to hear some things that Stephen's going to play that give you a sense of the atmosphere and the threats that are out there. But I guess I'm going to ask all of the panelists just to say some initial remarks. And go where you want to go. But with threats to elections that we're talking about today, I think we can think of it in a couple of ways. Some of the things that have happened, the terrible things, the changes in attitudes, but 2, also some of the institutional concerns that we have. What are the institutions we have in place? How should they be working? What about certifying elections or having post-election audits or how quickly we are able to count the votes? Are those types of things helpful, or can we do them in ways that are better to help mitigate the threats against elections? So with that, I open it up to Jocelyn to say a few words at the beginning, and then we'll go down the line.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me, and Rick, thanks for bringing us all together. I think, I started as a young law professor in my late 20s, about, I don't know how long ago that was, but it was Rick who was in many ways, well, I used his textbook at the time in my election law class, but also really leading the way at building a community of election law scholars. So thank you, Rick, for the work that you have put in to build this community through many ways and institutions over the years, because it is needed now more than ever. And I think a testament to the great names and voices you see here gathered today are really a reflection of Rick's work over decades to build that community that we're all been a part of in many ways. So thank you, and thank you all for being here. I think now as we look to the threats of democracy that we're facing, I've found, I'll just sort of say 3 things. One, I think that the pillars of democracy are rooted in people and the law. And there have been attacks on both of those pillars over the last few years, and the threats really are aimed at that, trying to overturn legal precedent, trying to make legal protections for voters and voter officials weaker. But even more than the law, the people in our system really will determine the future of our democracy. And that has also been under attack, both by the threats, the actual vitriolic threats that we'll talk more about today that we've all faced and that many have faced, that thousands have faced for doing our jobs of administering elections, but also the effort to replace people of integrity on both sides of the aisle in basically every potential position in democracy, from poll workers to secretaries of state and everything in between, with people who are not beholden to the law and the principles of democracy and are willing to skirt the law or really upend the system in order to advance certain partisan or political goals. And so when I think about the threats that we're facing today, the first 2 things I'll say is that without the law and without the people, then those threats will become realized. But as long as the law is strong and the courts uphold the law, and we have people at every aspect of the system upholding the principles of democracy, we can survive. And that brings me to my last point, which is that we will survive not only this moment, but we can also thrive. What I have seen over the last several years in the administrative position is a system in Michigan and nationwide that has endured great threats, but is stronger now in 2024 than we were at this stage leading up to the 2020 election. We are more organized, we are more coordinated, we have more professionals on both sides of the aisle, particularly in local positions, than ever before. And in many ways, the challenges and the threats that we all have endured in this system these last few years, we have worked to enable us to be more prepared for anything that's going to come our way in 2024. So I'm optimistic, and as someone who's done this work for several decades and has wanted to see a healthier and more vibrant and robust democracy emerge from various different points in our history, from the 2000 election to 2004 till now, I've only seen us writ large bend towards a healthier democracy, even though the challenges have been significant. And so I'm hopeful and really determined to make sure we get to the other side of the 2024 election with a stronger democracy than ever before.
Can I just follow up with one maybe more specific concern of mine? We saw in the 2020 election in your state, as well as other states, a number of potential sort of extra legal problems where either a local official or perhaps state officials might say they're not going to certify an election, right? Where we've counted the votes, we've gone through the legal process, and yet there's an administrative point. Could you walk us a little through that, both what that potential threat is, how real it is, how we get around it, or what we should think about reforming our institutions to sort of avoid that kind of last step problem that we probably weren't thinking a lot about before the 2020 election?
Yeah, well, notably, we've built in a whole system to election preparedness that involves post-election security and post-election work. And that is particularly focused on making sure after the unofficial results are reported that the people whose job it is to certify election results at the county and state level simply do their jobs. Under Michigan law and in many other states, it's not a substantive role, it's a ministerial role to simply certify the election results once they have been through basic math completed at the local and then ultimately state level. So in 2020, what we saw really unfold through what we now know and what's now been revealed through the work of the January 6th committee as the strategy to place alternate electors in the hands of Congress for perhaps adoption or the adoption of state legislatures to send to Congress. It was all really, the centerpiece of that was either delaying or blocking the certification of the election results at the state and local level. And I think it's important to note that strategy, which is entirely dependent on the people appointed to those positions, because the law is clear, but if they choose to not follow the law, we will see consequences, as we've said time and time again, but it will also create chaos and confusion and create a talking point for those who want to create an air of uncertainty and doubt around election results, falsely so, but uncertainty nonetheless. It gives them a hook to then take not just to courts, but to bolster state legislative decisions to support false slates of electors and all the rest. So it's a clear strategy that's geared not necessarily at blocking the ultimate certification of the process, because the law and several layers of the law are in place to ensure that valid election results will get certified in our state and in many others, and in nearly every state. So we'll get there eventually, essentially. Any efforts to block certification will fail, but they know that. And so the success is rooted in their ability to create chaos and confusion and uncertainty and doubt around election results as a strategy for pressuring political actors at other stages, state legislators and in Congress, to not accept the valid election results of the people and instead accept an alternative slate. And so that's the strategy we saw unfold. Michigan was the first state that was the domino to fall. The goal was to get us to delay our certification and then take that to Pennsylvania and just create this air of uncertainty that allowed the alternative slate of electors to be admitted and adopted. We saw that going in at the local level, and we worked to ensure our state was certified, which I can talk in greater detail about the nitty-gritty of that. But the bottom line is we're anticipating, as New Mexico and other states have illustrated, that this is a strategy that will not be just about presidential elections. It will be unfold in many other elections to come, but we have to talk about it and recognize it not from a necessarily successful legal strategy, because it won't be, but it could potentially be a successful narrative strategy to enable doubt and confusion around elections that also harms the ability for whoever is rightfully elected ultimately to govern with any legitimacy.
Neal?
John, thank you. And Rick, I echo the Secretary's comments, so thank you so much for hosting this. And you know, it's a challenge for a USC graduate to come here, so I just want to tell you that. I have some thoughts that I wanted to impart today, and I really thought the best way to do that was to write them down, because I have many thoughts that I want to talk about related to this, and I promise to keep it at 5 minutes. And so bear with me. This may be my Jerry Maguire moment, but hey, I'm retired, so that's okay. I served as the nonpartisan chief election official in Orange County, California for nearly 20 years. It's fair to say that not much surprises me anymore, but I'm dismayed at the attacks on free and fair elections and the erosion of trust playbook that has been used by one candidate after another. And quite frankly, I think many voters are starting to catch on. There are parallels to where we find ourselves today, and we don't have to dig too far in the past to shed some light on it. As electricity began to evolve in the 18th and 19th centuries, many people were too afraid to use it. Widespread fear of electricity caused many to believe that it involved black magic or witchcraft. In fact, one U.S. president, Benjamin Harrison, was so afraid of being electrocuted that he never touched a light switch in the White House. As the titans of the electrical industry battled it out, names such as Westinghouse, Edison, and Tesla capitalized on fear and spread disinformation about the dangers and mysteries of each other's solutions. To dominate the industrialization of electric power, spreading falsehoods and distorting the truth about competing technologies benefited the purveyor of mis- and disinformation. Sound familiar? Looking back on this, it's hard to imagine how seemingly rational people could be fooled so easily. Then again, fast forward to 21st century elections, and our past continues to haunt us. The continual volley between those proclaiming there is no widespread fraud in elections versus those who believe that all elections are ripe with fraud is getting us nowhere. Add to that a small subset of vocal individuals across the country whose extremist election fraud views are afforded outsized respect. As a result, upcoming elections are not very appealing to those that run them, and in fact, this has mutated into a real migraine for election officials. Before getting into those details, I want to examine the word fraud. The definition of fraud in its purest form is wrongful and criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. We should not conflate disagreements with laws, regulations, and rules of voting with the outrageous notion that all elections are rigged. Is there work to be done? Of course, and I want to give you one specific example. Too often, election officials are bound by outdated laws that should be updated, many of which can further the erosion of trust. Case in point, voter list maintenance needs an overhaul. Why are we compelled by laws to update our address if we move when it comes to our driver's license, our passport, our taxes, even our dog's license, but not our voter registration? Legal constraints on voter list maintenance can cause duplicate ballots, outdated addresses, and suspicion. These kinds of disparities only fuel a public hungry for explanations as to why their favored candidate lost an election and becomes the catalyst for future erosion of trust. The reality is that elections are far more secure than they were just a decade ago. As an example, many election officials deploy an array of pre- and post-election system testing, voter registration audits, risk-limiting audits, and software reviews that go well beyond the requirements found in federal and state law. These are not the days, folks, of the early 20th century when there was violence at the polls, stolen ballot boxes drifted down rivers, and party bosses manipulated elections and coerced voters. We shouldn't treat modern elections as though they are relics of the past. This fixation with blanket cries of fraud is not improving elections. In fact, the irony of chasing baffling conspiracy theories is that it can deter voting across party lines. And in response to Rick's question, what are some of the things that need to be done to assure free and fair elections and acceptance of election results in 2024? I humbly submit that we should continue to expand audits, partner with prosecutors on any violations of election law, improve the voter experience, and use election materials to communicate facts about misinformation directly with voters, which will continue to build trust and confidence among the electorate. In addition, as citizens, we ought to put more effort into improving elections and rely less on encouraging election denier litigants who think they can overturn election results based on rumor and conjecture. In fact, the courts have been nearly unanimous in this opinion as well. United States Federal Judge Linda Parker wrote in her decision related to a challenge following the 2020 November election, This case was about undermining the people's faith in our democracy and debasing the judicial process to do so. So, friends and colleagues, the next time you turn on a light switch, think back to a time when electricity ceased being a mere curiosity and we entered an expanded era of rationality, industry, and science. Likewise, we can continue to approve elections and have as much faith in turning on a light switch as we are in casting a ballot. Rational people can sort this out with respectful, mutually satisfying conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Neal. I'm going to go again, and I'm going to follow up on maybe a specific issue. You pointed to cleaning up the voter registration rules or modernizing them, improving them, as a way that we might tamp down some worries about election conspiracies. I want to put another issue on your plate, and that is one that you're familiar with here in California, having had to administer under California laws. The question of how quickly we count the ballots, and whether there aren't ways in which, and every state being different in their own ways, might find ways to have a quicker but also more transparent way of counting the ballots. I'm sure all conspiracy theorists would not find this satisfying, but there is the question for the average voter: well, why are our ballots not coming in? What's going on? Are there things that we can do in that realm to instill public confidence and to keep the worst of the conspiracy theorists about what's going on behind the scenes going forward?
That's a great question. I really believe there is. And in California, there was a real desire to expand the opportunities for voting, which is something that I supported and is understandable. And when you expand that, obviously, you're extending the time of the canvass. And all of the laws that have been passed in the last 10 years in California have done just that. We now have one of the longest canvasses in the country, I think maybe the longest, 30 days. And that does build suspicion, especially as you're processing provisional ballots or ballots that come in late, according to them, beyond Election Day. But of course, we know they're all cast before Election Day. And you're going through that process of doing the eligibility checks. One of the things that I did, and this is not for everybody, John, is to invest in technology that would speed up the canvass, because there are optics that are challenging when you are taking that full 30 days. And so we were able to cut that time in half. Not every county can do that, of course. But I would suggest that that's one way that we should work to improve the process, is to invest in technology, to invest in ways to improve that canvass process and to shorten that time frame. It just sows distrust when you have that too long.
Can I just add
Sure,
one
absolutely.
thing on that? Because
Yeah.
I totally agree. And I think we can't have that conversation without noting that the onus isn't entirely on election officials to meet those deadlines. With greater funding from lawmakers at the state and federal level, and laws that enable creative ways and transparent ways to tabulate ballots in a way that is transparent and secure, that's also what gets us there. And so it's really important when you hear others saying we should do this. We would love support from the federal government to better fund and more fully fund our elections so that we can meet these more stringent goals. And we have to recognize that the onus can't just be on local election officials to speed up the process and increase capacity without additional funding and laws to enable more options and creativity and transparency for doing that.
Stephen.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I'm Stephen Richer. I'm the Maricopa County Recorder responsible for recording, which I'm sure is very exciting to all of you, voter registration and early voting in the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States, not the third. Don't give Harris County that. Thanks very much to Rick. You're the man. Thanks very much to UCLA Law. I went there this morning because that's where I thought it was. And that was a double bummer because, one, I was in the wrong spot, and two, I learned that it's a lot prettier than my law school. So,
But we'll let you make a provisional speech here because you're in the wrong location. Sorry.
But I think this is titled Threats, and so I thought I would give a few examples, and I think we have an audio clip that we mashed together that's 3 minutes, and then I promise I'll only speak for 2 minutes. But just to give you a sense of what continues to this day, I would say it happens on a weekly basis. I think the first 3 are to me, to my personal cell phone, and then 2 are to our call center. So do we have that somehow lined up?
So I see you're for fair and competent elections, as that's what it says here on your homepage for your recorder position you're trying to fly here. But you call things unhinged and insane lies when there's a forensic audit going on. You need to check yourself. You need to do your fucking job right, because other people from other states are watching your ass, You fucking renege on this deal or give them any more troubles, your ass will never make it to your next little board meeting.
Richard, you know you're going to have to stand before God someday, you reprobate piece of shit. Why are you such a fucking traitor to your country? You know damn well them motherfuckers cheated on that election. You know, I don't know who paid you off, but you're going to need that money to keep the fire burning in hell where you're going, you piece of shit.
Well, you're even more corrupt than anybody else. You just got into fucking office. Well, listen, you fucking liar. First of all, you weren't the recorder at the time of the election. Second of all, they're not handing everything over. Why is that? And third of all, Arizona never did an official audit. You fucking liar. So pull your head out of your ass. Stop being a fucking liar. Go on TV and tell the fucking truth. You fucking creep.
We still have 600,000 ballots to count. We received 1.9. We received 1.9 million ballots in Arizona.
20,000 ballots yesterday. I could do that with my eyes closed.
They released
I could do that with my eyes closed.
60,000
Wow.
results for.
Is that much better? Are you trying to make a point? No, this is 60,000. Are you serious?
I don't know.
Are you fucking serious?
Are you a Maricopa County resident, sir?
Nah.
I can file a complaint for you if you are.
I'm just disgusted by people like you. You're a fucking joke. You deserve
I'm sorry,
to be
I
called
do
out.
not tolerate that kind of language. If you would like to
Someone
talk
should
to me in a
shoot
civil,
you in the head.
I'm hanging up.
We're clearly.
It's a fucking disgrace, sir. It really is disgusting.
Okay.
You people are doing.
Look, if you have a concern, I can actually.
Listen, why don't you?
Then I'll be happy to help you.
We're going to arrest all you people that were involved in this. You're going to be hung or shot. That's what they do for traitors, sir. For treason.
Just so you're aware.
So you better think of that, sir. What you want to do, sir.
You have your
When we arrest you people for treason, you're going to be shot or hung. You're going to have to decide, I guess, which one you want.
Okay, look.
Because we're going to investigate, sir. We're going to investigate. You people are going to be arrested, sir. For corruption. For treason.
Okay. I don't have to take this. I don't have to take threats. Goodbye.
So we continue to get those, like I said, on a weekly basis. The last two were from people who work our call center who probably make $17 an hour, maybe $16 an hour. Certainly not a great recruitment tool, but they continue to do that, and I'm very proud of them. Why does this continue to happen? Look, all people have agency. I'm a huge believer in free will, so ultimately it's down to those, to use his term, reprobates, who called in. But the incentive structure is such that I fear that this will continue. My wife, who's here, knows that I hate when Disney continues to make Marvel movies. I'm just like, oh my God, another superhero. But I imagine Bob Iger just sitting in wherever the Disney headquarters is and be like, should we print $1 billion or not? I think we should. And so let's make another Marvel movie. And so unfortunately, a lot of incentive structures are there for people who are in positions or leadership to continue to do this. And that's especially true on my side. Jocelyn said she's optimistic. In many ways, I have a little bit of optimism, at least on the national scale. In Arizona, I am deeply, deeply pessimistic because this is a necessary ingredient for winning a Republican primary in the state of Arizona is to say that the 2020 election and now the 2022 election, and maybe we'll throw on some others, were stolen in order to win a Republican primary. And in some ways, politicians are behaving rationally and they are simply going along with an incentive structure. And then we get people like the five who you heard from who will continue to be outraged because they hear from people they trust, people they believe that the world is being stolen from them. And so then we get voicemails like that. And I think it's going to be hard to break out of that cycle.
I do want to follow up on the issue of direct threats from the public with all of you and around here. Let me ask you one more specific question, and then let's all three talk about this because I know you're all facing this. You came into office just after the 2020 election, but of course, the aftermath of the election and literally the post-election audits, which got a lot of, I think deservedly bad press in Arizona were going on. Could you say something about not only the post-election process, the audit process, but what is legitimate and what kind of oversight and post-election looking at this is legitimate, and where were the lines crossed, or where could the lines be crossed where it becomes illegitimate? Because certainly something after the election and looking back and oversight is appropriate, and yet other things might actually be very harmful to our system.
So one of the good things about all of this, or I mean, a good thing about this is people became more aware of the post-election audits that are in fact done, because Arizona has long done post-election audits. So after the tabulation of all the ballots, which are paper ballots, then to make sure that the machines were properly calibrated and were reading the ballots correctly, there's a test done, of course, before the election, but then there's a test deck that is fed through the machines again. But more importantly, a statistically significant number of ballots are pulled from the actual ballots that are counted. They are then sent to bipartisan groups, Republican and Democrat, sitting across from each other, and they do a hand count tally of, like I said, a statistically significant percentage, and that amounted to about 47,000 votes that were cast in the 47,000 votes that were hand counted prior to the 2020 election, and they matched the machine count 100%. And so things like that are important. What is not helpful is having a group of partisan warriors who were conspiracy theorists who thought Hugo Chavez had stolen the election somehow from the grave and had already said that Donald Trump had won the 2020 election, to then go spend 6 months with no election expertise, just making every single sort of conspiracy theory that you possibly could, and it was a disaster. It probably is why Arizona became the global hotspot for this movement.
Okay, I mentioned I do want to go down the line on this issue of direct threats to election officials, but I do want to also tell the audience that we are going to be moving to audience questions in a little bit. So if you are looking to have a question, there's a microphone at each side of the room, and we will then begin calling on people when we move to that section. So there's a warning. Maybe I'll just start down this end and work this way. Yeah. But Steve, so what we heard was terrible, and we unfortunately have heard that story across the country in a number of ways. Election officials, I don't want to say you were anonymous, but you were somewhat anonymous in an earlier era, and maybe in a good way, and you've become sometimes well-known and targets of people's ire. What do we do about it? Both what do we do, and I know there are people involved in various efforts here, legally and institutionally or attitudinally. What is to be done about the great rise in personal threats to people who are running our elections across the country?
I think there has to be a narrative shift that the country has to embrace. I think I think of it as when U.S. soldiers during the Vietnam War and how they were treated, and regardless of, but we've moved to a culture in which you might not agree with the military action, but you support ultimately the men and women in the armed forces. And so I think that there has to be sort of this culture where you don't disrespect, you don't target the people who are working the actual election machinery, and you think of them as sort of public servants. You might not agree with every law, and as Neal said, that's certainly open for discussion and is something that we should continue to contest and to improve. But you don't go and target them as they come back from Vietnam, I guess. So a cultural change.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Stephen's saying. I would also add that, when you look at data currently, election officials, there's some good data out there that 3 and 5 are more afraid today than they were in 2020. And 4 and 5 are concerned about running their elections. In other words, getting the people to work them, poll workers, to actually come and work the elections. And to Stephen's point earlier about, I don't think this is going to go away, I definitely agree with that. So we need to look at ways to reduce the risk of these threats. And I'm working with a group called the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections. It's a 32-member nonpartisan body that is focused on working collaboratively together with law enforcement election officials to help reduce the risk. And how do you do that? You raise awareness, you work on plans with law enforcement to be able to respond if there are threats more quickly than perhaps in the past. I will say that we are seeing, there are election deniers in the law enforcement community, and that can create certainly problems around the country and something that we need to continue to work on.
Yes, I can tell you how it took law enforcement 45 minutes to get to my house even though they knew an hour before the now infamous protest outside my house was going to begin, that it was happening. So yes, on all those things, I'll add two pieces. One, the law. So we in Michigan, the first thing we did in January with a cooperative legislature at the state level has been to introduce a package of laws to protect those who protect democracy, making it a felony to threaten election officials, stiffening the penalties as well, and the sentencing penalties. We're also pursuing a law to ban the intentional dissemination of deceptive practices in elections. So if you intentionally repeat or disseminate information or allow for the dissemination of information that you know is false about election procedures and the like, there should be penalties and consequences for that. Because we know that the root of these threats are this misinformation that then generates people to, with vitriol, try to attack those who are at the forefront of democracy. So strengthening our laws at the state level, I know Nevada, I know a number of states are doing that as well. It would be great to see the federal government make a stand on this and both support through financial investment our election officials in our elections, and also further protections. I know Senator Ossoff and others have proposed legislation on that front. But in the face of that inaction at the federal level, we're working at the state level to implement those changes and those additional protections. I think what Georgia's done to have a text system, so if a poll worker is threatened on election day, there's a place they can text that will connect to law enforcement clerks and others so we could rapidly respond, is important. So we're also adding additional administrative protections for election day as well. But the thing I really want to land with and sort of really emphasize here is what got us through 2020 is sort of like spiritually, emotionally, all that, was the fact that the truth is on our side. Like, democracy is on our side. The law is on our side. History is on our side. The Constitution is on our side. And the vast majority of the American people are on the side of wanting to preserve democracy and knowing that these threats are wrong. We find a lot of strength in those truths in Michigan and elsewhere. And through that, it enables us to sort of absorb that and come back stronger, to the point where, I've tried to kind of emulate that leadership in Michigan. I know others have as well, to really just show strength in the face of these threats, because that's how we get through it. But what I saw on Election Day in 2020 was extraordinary. First of all, we recruited 30,000 new election workers in Michigan in 2020 and another 11,000 in Michigan in 2022. Those folks are coming to our defense. They are coming to defense of democracy. And I visit polling places in every election, state, local, federal, throughout our state. What I saw in November 2022 was extraordinary, because usually when I show up at a polling place, people are just doing their jobs. When I showed up to the polling place, one of that I vote in, and there's a number of precincts in Detroit on Election Day in 2022, I was met with almost like this overwhelming force of energy coming from the election officials who showed up that day to work. Instead of being tired or sort of ho-hum or seeing the procedural, sort of doing their job, there was a pride there. There was a energy there that I have never seen before. And that was extraordinary to me. And I then saw that all around the state. The people who run our elections in many ways, when they come to it with that strength and emboldened by these threats, they stand up stronger and they do their work with more pride and determination to ensure these threats will not succeed at interfering with our process of election administration. So that's like real experience, and gives me a lot of hope that with leadership and with that strength and that knowledge of who we are, and that we're on the right side of history here, we can harness all that to actually create more energy around protecting our election officials, at the very least in the administration space. And that's what we've worked to do in Michigan. Obviously, it's not universal, but that's, in my view, the path out of this moment.
John, can I add one footnote to what the Secretary was saying? And it's on the misinformation front. When I was, just before I left office, was receiving hundreds of requests as people were marshaled post-election to request materials from us. And election officials around the country are receiving the same requests. For instance, I want all of your cast vote records that were cast during the election. And then they would ask, and what is a cast vote record? And what do we do with it? And so to me, this is just quite frankly, ignorance on top of misinformation. And election officials, having a slow march to the sea, need to continue to educate the public on these post-election issues. And I think it's not an easy solution. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think we need to continue to do that.
Well, Neal anticipated my last question for the panel, so I'm going to put it this way. All of you, in fact, I don't know any election official across the country who doesn't believe in transparency and sort of education and reaching out often to critics of elections, people who don't understand. There are, of course, various state laws which require open access to things. So one, I guess I'd like to have you talk about how you do that or how it's successful. But then there's the question some people are asking, are people taking advantage of this transparency? Are there ways in which there are lots of record requests or observers who move beyond observer status to become active participants or protesters? So tell us about transparency and education, but also where you think there might be issues and whether we need to fine-tune some of those processes.
Oh, go ahead, Stephen.
No,
Do you want to
please.
start? Well, I think one of the things we've done in Michigan and that we've seen work is creating an ongoing support for our local election officials as they do pre-election testing of machines, post-election audit, really amplifying that work, but also not being the only voice to amplify that work. And so we've created a Truth Tellers Task Force in Michigan that is comprised of faith leaders, community leaders, business leaders, and sports leaders in all of our 83 counties. We're going to be building that this year so that in 2024, we have voices, locally known and trusted voices who aren't election officials, who also serve as trusted voices of information, but we've also been targets to try to diminish that trust. So let's find other trusted sources of information like faith leaders and others who can build that faith and confidence in our elections, and then combine that with the increased transparency work that many clerks and officials are already doing so that the information gets out there. Because again, the benefit of this is that the more transparency of the process in a good faith effort is in some ways another antidote to the challenges facing democracy today. So we've also got to not just do that transparency, but make sure it reaches the people who need it, and meeting people where they are through people they have already built trusting relationships with, and going there to communities ourselves and having these conversations is part of what we're adding to our portfolio and work this year as we work to kind of overcome some of the challenges. But it is, I think we're also sharing, and really, I know Arizona has had unique challenges as well that you're developing some creative ways around.
Yeah, we've tried everything under the sun, and it feels good, and of course we're going to continue to do that. Sometimes people ask me, well, have any of your communications efforts worked? And it's like, oh, well, thank you for validating the last 2 years of my life. But if you look at some of the longitudinal studies on confidence in elections, I mean, there's a little bit of reason to believe that it's working. It's hard to draw a causal link there. But we're going to continue to try it because, quite frankly, that's what we can do. I think the most efficacious thing that we have is tours. Some of you actually joined us for a tour 2 days ago, 3 days ago, something like that. And I probably did 40 tours of our elections facility in the weeks leading up to the August primary and the November general election. And so really when you can see the machinery, when you can humanize the process, see the people behind it, see the life of the whole paper ballot, that helps. It is a trade-off. As John mentioned, there's a strong trade-off because we stream our tabulation center 24/7, 365. People will pull footage from that and they'll manipulate it, and then they'll do deep fakes that will get very popular on the internet, or they'll identify employees who are non-public facing employees and then they'll target them on various social media programs. Our default has always been to be more transparent, but yeah, it's often thrown in our face, and I guess that's just something that we're going to have to continue to learn with, to deal with. Have a little bit of patience for elections officials, as John suggested. Prior to 2016, nobody really gave a darn about sort of how the process worked, and there weren't many communications specialists within elections departments. And so we are just getting better and better, but we're still playing catch up in terms of communicating how the mousetrap actually works, whereas the name of the game just used to be the mousetrap itself prior to really the last 5 years.
Yeah, I agree with both comments. I would add that I took advantage of the good studies that are out there and the research that's been done on trusted voices in elections, and in local communities, it's the election official. Despite all the things that we hear, the most trusted voice is that election official. And one of the things I wanted to do was target the influence peddlers of election deniers directly and open up our process, like Stephen talked about, having the streaming service for post-election work. But I took it a little bit further and built a broadcast platform with our team to actually use cameras that focus on the ballots, to use screenshots of what the operators are seeing, to really give them in the weeds look, as opposed to a football field view, of the process. And we actually changed a few hearts and minds. And if you do it one little step at a time, that's going to be very important. I want to just leave with this. When Bernie Sanders, the whole issue in California, if you recall, in the primary where that was a real challenge, his observers and supporters descended on my office in the hundreds. And at the end of it all, they were supporting us on Reddit. They were supporting us on social media outlets because of the tours and because of that face-to-face communication and dialogue. So again, it's that slow march to the sea, but we can someday win this.
And there have been a lot of innovations. For instance, you can rebuild the voting record through the cast vote record, and a lot of data scientists can do this. Some jurisdictions are now posting the ballot images online. I think the holy grail will be when you can get a receipt, even if you vote by mail, of the people that you voted for, but we have to do that in a manner where it is not accessible by anyone on the back end. No jurisdiction does this currently, just because when people ask me can you tell me how I voted in the 2020 election? It's like, do you really want me to be like, yeah, you voted for President Trump, and so did your neighbor, so well done, you guys, or something like that. But I think that is still the thing that we get the most questions about, is why can't I have a receipt for who I voted for? And it's just because we haven't. The sacrosanct principle right now is the secrecy of the ballot, and so we haven't figured out a way to completely make that so nobody on the back end, because Chase Bank can access your account, because a lot of people say, why can't you do it like banks? Well, Chase can access how many dollars you have in your bank account. You don't want that for election administrators. So. But we've tried other methods, like allowing people to obviously track their ballot through all stages of the process, allowing people to get text message alerts at all stages of the process, allowing people to go on their voter profile and see all the elections that they did cast a ballot in, not how they voted, but cast a ballot in. And so some stuff like that, I think, has been appreciated.
And I'll just add to all of that we all have a responsibility here. And I don't mean I sound like a broken record, but when it comes to the innovations like these, they are made possible by greater funding at the state and federal level for us to advance and explore these innovations that promote transparency. Research that so many of you do enables us to generate ideas that we can then implement and test, and then match with that funding to make real. And so for me, one of the biggest frustrations of doing this work, having worked at it from different angles throughout my career, is it's less now, but a lot of ways in which we have to solve these problems on our own when we can collaboratively solve these issues. And I don't mean to call them problems, but we can collaboratively meet these challenges through partnerships with various different entities that are all well-intentioned. And again, that's why we see a lot of that partnership ability starting to now be attacked. But nevertheless, partnerships with state and local government and federal level through funding and partnerships with research and academics help us develop the data that enables us to develop these solutions. So I just really want to emphasize there's a role for all of us to play in this work. And the more we can actually enable collaboration and the partnership building and public-private partnerships, the more it enables us to meet these needs of this moment of greater transparency, greater efficiency of tabulating ballots, and everything in between.
Yeah, but quick +1 for what Secretary Benson said. I paid for all of that transparency, that additional transparency, with CARES Act funding. It was additional funding on top of my regular budget at the county level. So absolutely.
Okay, we're going to go to your questions, and I ask a few things. One, identify yourself, especially because I have a bright light above you. I can't really see you. Two, ask something quick. And three, make sure it's a question. So right here on the right.
Hi, I'm Andrew Appel from Princeton University, and my question is about best practices for transparency and trust in running early vote centers.
I can't answer this question.
Traditional American precinct, you can say to the voter, well, your political party had a poll watcher there who could see that the people that signed the poll book were registered voters, and that they could check off that on their own list. They could see that nobody voted twice. They could see that when the voting machine printed out its totals at the end of the day, what the totals were, and that there weren't more votes than the number of people that voted. And if they were concerned about how the county clerk added up all the precincts, well, your party had challengers in every precinct that could see those numbers and add them up for themselves. But with early vote centers that have to, cover many ballot styles from across the whole county, and with electronic poll books, and with sort of breakdown or reporting of vote totals by different ballot styles and precincts, the story is much more complicated and sometimes, I think, harder to trust. So where are the places that do this well, and how do they do it well? I'm really curious about this, and are there some places that do it less well? That's my question.
I think it's a great question. Andrew, it's good to see you, and thank you for the question. We moved to vote centers in Orange County in 2020, and if you're familiar with the vote center process in California, it's about half of the counties currently operate vote centers, so 11 days of voting early. And one of the things, to your point directly, that I did is to provide electronic data to not only the campaigns, but observers and poll watchers that would show in real time the process of individuals casting their ballot. In other words, what was their party, what's their address, what's their name, et cetera. And they would then use that in comparison to what they saw in the vote center itself. Not everybody used it, not everybody took advantage of it, but it is one additional layer that you can put on top of the vote center process for transparency.
Yeah, I was going to say sorry for interrupting, but that my entire state is in mourning because of your school, because Princeton beat University of Arizona. So I don't know if I can really even acknowledge this question, but there's sort of this the days of your mythology that when we had voting by precinct, you could simply show up and, you would see that, well, if this precinct's supposed to have 2,000 voters, and then, you would see and you would be able to match the ballots. Well, as soon as you started having vote by mail and vote by mail heavy jurisdictions, then that went out the window because, you can't account for those don't come in by precinct into the post office and then go there. And so it's not like you can say, well, if I watch 50 people show up to this voting location, then this precinct can't have more than 50 voters anyways. And so, we produce on a daily basis a cast vote log and who checked in, and the political parties use that. That's why they can stop texting you after you've cast a ballot, and so they don't try and drive you to the polls. I think that there is more that we can do about that, but I'm really hesitant to move away from the vote center model just because voters really, really enjoy it. It also creates a redundancy in voting locations just at a point when we need them the most, just because, it doesn't take much imagination to imagine someone doing something stupid at one of the voting locations, where under a precinct-based voting system, everyone at that location would be out of luck, but now you can go down the road just 2 miles away and you can go to another voting location. So, but I do think that there's more. It's just when you're talking about numbers like my county has 2.5 million registered voters, sort of the ability of average Joe to do anything with that data set is pretty limited. And all data scientists in elections already know that the election isn't stolen because they can see the voting patterns and how they would line up, and there's no just sort of sudden blotches of blue or red. And so I don't know how much it helps average Joe.
Okay, we're going to go here to the left again.
Hi. Is my mic on?
Yes.
Good. I can't hear it. I'm David Holtzman. I'm a graduate of Princeton University.
No questions for you. No.
No, I have connections to Michigan and Arizona as well. I'm also a 2000 graduate of the law school here in its public interest law program. I'm a former poll worker, a former president of the League of Women Voters of Los Angeles, and a current redistricting commissioner for Los Angeles County. I wanted to ask about rogue poll workers and rogue election workers. What sort of civil remedies or administrative remedies or criminal penalties do you think people should be considering, or you might consider, to discourage election workers from failing to do their job in the critical moments when it counts most?
I think we dealt with this challenge head-on in 2022, where there was widely reported organized efforts to infiltrate polling places with, you could say, rogue poll workers. I think at the first, and we saw a lot of pressure in counties all across our state, which do the hiring of poll workers for the most part, to pressure clerks into hiring individuals. And we recognize two things. One, we have to, and it's important to have balance when it comes to poll workers from both parties and all that, both are under our law and just as a good practice. So we don't want to diminish that, and we don't want to make assumptions that a person's party affiliation indicates a rogue status. And so we continue to recruit and encourage poll workers from both parties. And even some clerks worked with some of these efforts to ensure that we were being as transparent and open as possible and accessible for everyone, because there's nothing to hide in terms of the actual process itself being secure and operating with integrity. So that said, we work to sort of recognize the input challenges, but there was no question in terms of the actual election day or election work that there would be no tolerance for any shenanigans. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Yeah. For any, and I use that word throughout the 22 election cycle, but any shenanigans from anyone. And so the challenge became making sure we were empowering people to respond if anyone showed themselves to be a bad actor. So we did that in a couple of ways. One, every precinct had very clear rules about what poll workers could do. We asked every poll worker to sign a code of conduct going into Election Day, indicating both that they were knowledgeable about the guardrails that they were going to be expected to abide by, and that if they didn't, they would be removed. Then you have to empower people in every precinct to remove people and have a system in place to, if things escalate, de-escalate, and then perhaps remove. So working with local law enforcement, develop those partnerships, and then having an additional level of coverage with our staff. Some of you may know I came out of sort of voter protection work in the nonpartisan space, where you have people on the ground in precincts all throughout the state to rapidly respond to issues. So now we do the same thing at the Department of State. And in every election, particularly in ones of great prominence, we have people throughout the state who work directly and are connected directly to our own war room, so that we can identify and rapidly respond to things. And then if we get asked by the press, talk about them from a place of sort of of information, as opposed to or debunking things that could, or rumors of things happening that aren't really happening. So our goal is also to have, in addition to a line of communication coming from polling places, at every point throughout the day, my office has someone within 5 to 10 minutes of every precinct, every one of our 4,500 precincts in the state, so that if anything occurs, we can be there on the ground immediately, well-trained people to just figure out how to address the situation. So that was our sort of our bifurcated way of doing it. And then also, the other thing to keep in mind is in Michigan, our clerks hire our poll workers at the local level. The work we did in 2020 to recruit 30,000 new election workers meant we were almost fully staffed for 2022, long before any efforts to infiltrate the process began. So there were very little openings for poll workers as we began this process. There were always turnover, always openings available. And so recognizing that, we also regenerated and recruited 11,000 new poll workers as well, to ensure there was an abundance of talent, and that clerks then could pick and choose who they wanted to hire and actually do the work to make sure people you're putting in poll worker positions or any other positions have been vetted, and also, again, know the guardrails that they have to abide by once they're employed.
Yeah, but what about the additional financial or criminal penalties for bad actors going forward?
Yes, we are seeking them and trying to develop them in the state, but also have sort of well-established voter intimidation and other types of protections that we can use in partnership with local prosecutors and Attorney General. We actually did a press conference right before Election Day to basically say, anyone thinking of trying anything, don't do it, because you will be held responsible. You won't succeed in actually creating chaos and confusion, but you will find yourself with a criminal record potentially. And just to be very clear that, no tolerance for disruptions.
I would add to shenanigans, I wouldn't tolerate any tomfoolery too. So, but I do.
Malarkey, yeah, no.
Right. But I do want to say something that was probably a little controversial. I received some online criticism for it, so I felt a little bit proud of it. and that is that for all of our Vote Center employees, had them run through law enforcement backgrounds where we did intelligence checks on them. I didn't, the law enforcement folks did. And we discovered, about 10 individuals that had social media platforms that were clearly, they had an agenda moving forward on this. And so we took action on that. Secretary Benson talked about the vetting process. I think that's very important. By the way, none of the organizations that I'm still working with endorse that. I just want to make that clear, but I think that's a very important process that we should be doing.
Worried about it, planned for it, turned out to be not that big of an issue. It was actually one of our greatest strengths. Whenever anyone says, I think this is going on, I say, well, come work for us, and now you're complicit. So.
Well, we have a long day ahead of us. This has been a great kickoff to our event. I want to thank the panelists for being with us.
Thank you.
It's good seeing you.
You too.